Hey guys, it's BlockchainBrad, and today I'm very honoured to speak with Matt Spoke. He is the CEO of none other than AION. He is here to provide for an update for everything that is happening of late with the AION team, tech, and beyond. Matt, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Brad. Good to be back.
So, mate, obviously there's a lot happening. I noticed your slogans have even changed since we last spoke. So you recognise as a multi-tiered system. Let's talk about scalability. Let's talk about interoperability. What's been happening in terms of tech lately, specifically, with regard to those terms?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if you go back kind of to some of the original designs that we had proposed in the white paper, two of the major elements that are kind of coming into our roadmap right now are the different versions of bridging that we've been building. So we built our AION token bridge. By the end of this year, we'll have kind of a generic token bridge where any kind of ERC20 based token can be able to swap kind of back and forth between AION and Ethereum. And that's kind of for the interoperability layer. We've still got a lot of research going on in terms of what long-term designs for interoperability look like. The bridging was kind of, version one of this attempt to do cross-chain communication and transactions. I think for all intents and purposes, we've proven that it works. We're still trying to figure out how to prove that it can scale efficiently as a mechanism for cross-chain communication and transactions. So that's still an active effort. Our bridge team is still hard at work in terms of like longer term research and getting this next version of the bridge into production. In parallel to that, Aion Virtual Machine has been a big part of our focus. We still have a very strong and active virtual machine team working on this new Java-based virtual machine, which actually just last week went into beta internally with the team. So it's being tested, and then the goal and timeline still continues to be a public beta with public testnet access for external community members to start interacting with the AVM by the end of this year, so December.
Okay. So Matt, just on the VM as well, Matt, talk us through why it's important, if at all, to have your own VM,
Sure.
Because obviously very few do have that. What sets that apart once you can have the VM running for your own system?
It's not so much the importance of having our own VM, it's the importance of learning lessons from how virtual machines have been built over the course of 2 decades. And so the Ethereum virtual machine, I think, has introduced a lot of really interesting concepts, but it was also proven to have a lot of significant bottlenecks and just performance gaps that don't have like a short-term path to be solved. And even the Ethereum community is now starting to shift its focus towards something we call EWASM, or WebAssembly. We kind of piggybacked off of a lot of established industry work that was happening on the Java Virtual Machine. The Java Virtual Machine is a system that's been in development and production and use for the last 15 years. AVM kind of borrows from a lot of the concept of the Java Virtual Machine to make available the Java tooling ecosystem. So, we figured that along with the very, very hardened infrastructure of the JVM, we can make all of the features required within a blockchain decentralized environment, available, and then also poured in existing support for all this Java tooling ecosystem that's been well developed over the course of a number of years, instead of having to kind of reinvent from scratch. We'll continue to support as a project. We'll continue to support Solidity as a language. We'll continue to support compatibility to Ethereum, but we'll be opening up compatibility to kind of the Java ecosystem to make it easier for these types of engineers to onboard.
Right, okay. Because obviously in the beginning there was quite a connection with Ethereum when you first started up.
Of course.
So is that connection still strong though, even though you're moving more towards your own complete architecture? Do you still have that strong correlation, that strong link with the EVM and the Ethereum community?
Yeah, and I mean, our roadmap is as far as we have planned our roadmap, there is continued intent to support Solidity and Ethereum type functionality and tooling. Partially for being able to run dual versions of applications between Ethereum and AION, and also just as a migration path. We also think there's just some really interesting features that have been made available in Solidity for kind of proof of concepts and prototyping. As we get into more complex business processes and applications that are like more complicated in nature, we think that the Java environment will be able to solve for a lot of that. The AVM tooling that we build and bring in from the Java world is going to be a big jump forward. A lot of the work happening on the Ethereum 2.0 roadmap around EWASM is really interesting. We follow it very closely, and our team is starting to do some research as to the gaps and differences between what we do and what EWASM is promising. The biggest gap, I think, in the short term is the fact that the WebAssembly community is very new, and there's not a huge number of existing tools available for developers. The Java community is extremely established, and we can get kind of out of the box support for a number of very, very mature and established and used tools, so that you're not having to introduce engineers to a completely new workflow. Because that's been a big gap, is when you take a software engineer into the blockchain space, you kind of have to relearn how to ride a bike to a certain extent. And we think we can kind of skip a lot of that early onboarding process.
And also, Matt, considering that you're already looking into WASM, is it possible in the future to also integrate that? Not only are you doing your own system now, but that could surely expand, to that potential with WebAssembly.
I think in the future, it's quite possible that we end up with systems that support multiple execution environments, and WebAssembly is very much top of the list if that becomes the case. I don't think this is like a pick one and stick to it forever. I think we're going to see systems that are able to run multiple execution environments. So we'll follow closely the developments happening in the WebAssembly world, but for now, our priority is focusing on the Java Virtual Machine and the support of the Aion Virtual Machine on top of that.
Right. Well, Matt, let's talk about scalability now, because obviously you'd know since you've started, and many people listening to this discussion have heard all kinds of numbers being thrown out, but it is important. And let's talk about why. Why do you need to have this inbuilt scalability? How is your scalability in terms of testing with proof in mind for now and then for next year, let's say? Let's focus on the short term.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of the conversation on scalability gets lost in marketing rhetoric in terms of like how many transactions per second you can support and all these things. The big balance that we've been trying to find is how do you build an efficient scaling roadmap that doesn't require a significant trade-off in decentralization. So, if you go to one end of the spectrum, you see projects like EOS that have promised the moon, but have significantly sacrificed on like models of decentralization. And in fact, underperformed on their performance numbers. If you've seen some of the more recent kind of breakdowns of benchmarking, we're still focused on core architecture of decentralization first and foremost. The two aspects of scaling solutions that are coming into our core roadmap are the AVM and a new version of a consensus algorithm that we're designing, which we've referred to in our white paper as kind of our hybrid consensus. And both of these will have impacts in terms of how blocks are produced, transactions are validated, and how quickly transactions can be kind of processed among peers on the network. And the numbers of those are not flushed out because we haven't finished implementing the AVM into our public network, nor have we finished designing the new version of the consensus algorithm. In current form, the Aion network still performs at something like 3 to 4 times the numbers of the Ethereum network in terms of like transaction throughput. But realistically, we're still long ways out from mainstream requirements because these numbers are all kind of in isolation.
Right.
The Ethereum market has proven that you don't actually need the absolute top end of that scale quite yet because it's been very, very few days where these networks have reached peak capacity. So it's really kind of preparing for that next wave of mainstream developers. AVM is going to be a big change because we can start supporting parallel transaction processing, where we should be able to see kind of orders of magnitudes improvement on top of where we are today. But we don't have perfect benchmark numbers to kind of to put out there at this stage.
Right. So in that sense, Matt, the tech first, would you argue, for this kind of adoption that you're talking about, with this mainstream influx of application, do you need to have that tech built in? Just thinking about the chicken before the egg, what do you need first for this to happen? Because obviously there is a lot of interest from the institutional side to come into this at some point in the next few years.
Yeah, of course. And this is where we think our AVM strategy is going to be quite differentiated from other projects. I mean, we've got 3 major characteristics we look at. We have we call this our blockchain readiness framework. And our blockchain readiness framework, if you can imagine, it kind of looks like a triangle. And the 3 tips of the triangle are security, scalability, and usability. And every decision we make, we're kind of measuring inside this blockchain readiness framework. And we think that every project that we compare ourselves to fits inside this triangle somehow. You either make decisions that optimize to one corner of the triangle, or you make decisions that are kind of properly balanced between these 3 corners. Because in many cases, what you're doing is you're making significant architectural trade-offs to enhance one at the expense of the other. So when we actually make architectural decisions, we score them in this framework that we have. We score a decision to say, hey, if I were to improve this feature in the AVM, it increases my score on this internal framework that we have by X points. And here's the trade-off that we're kind of balancing. So when we go to the technical steering committee of the Aion Foundation with these these types of architectural decisions, it's always being balanced inside this readiness framework, which we've found to be very helpful, so that we're not making decisions kind of in a vacuum. Usability we find to be a very, very under discussed topic. Absolutely. Where there's tons of need to make the on-ramp for developers to work inside these ecosystems more efficient within the protocol, and then also in the tooling layer above the protocol. So beyond the core engineering work that we're doing, which is, again, the three major pillars of what we're working on today are on the VM layer with the AVM, at the consensus layer with our hybrid consensus, and at the interoperability layer with our bridging. But then above that, we have all these tooling requirements. And these tooling requirements we're passing out to our community, and we're doing that through our grant program and through partnerships, where we have companies coming in and saying, hey, I can develop a developer infrastructure to make it easier for mobile applications to launch on top of AION, or to make it easier to host nodes on top of the network. These types of things. We've got about 10 or 15 of these active tooling grants that are being built, either live today or in development. And all of them have kind of that goal of making the life of a developer easier. And that's all focused on the Solidity side of our market. And then when we open up the Java functionality, then we're going to have a whole other tooling strategy for the Java world to be able to bring in existing and established tools into the AION community.
And when's that likely to happen, Matt? Because obviously that will open up a vast number of opportunities for developers, because it's so much more common. When is that likely to happen?
The timeline right now on the AVM that we're pretty confident about is that we're getting public beta of the AVM live before the end of 2018. And then we're going to have that live and supported on the public network, on the mainnet, within Q2 of 2019. So we're looking at kind of like a May-June timeframe. And that'll not only include kind of full support for the AVM, but also the tooling required to interact with the AVM efficiently will be on that timeframe.
So how's the feedback been so far on the GitHub, for example, and the already existent developing environment and ecosystem you have built globally? Because already you're out there making sure that you're at conferences, you're engaging with developers worldwide, I imagine. So how is the current state of developing on the AION network right now?
It's going really well. I mean, the two things that you'll notice is that, and more to come on this, but little sneak peeks. I mean, one, the AVM has not been released yet to the public, and it will be released relatively shortly. We're looking at a same time frame before the end of the year. That's open sourcing the AVM code base and the process of developing the AVM, so that we can start gathering feedback from the community, not only so they can start using it, but they can start kind of poking holes in our code base. And that'll be happening in the coming weeks, if not month, but before the end of the year. And then the second thing that we haven't really been all that transparent about is the fact that we've been developing a second version of the AION kernel. So the AION kernel we may have mentioned previously is a code base built in Java. And one of the things that we have identified as a big vulnerability on many of our peers' networks is the fact that if you run an entire blockchain on a single code base, if you find a vulnerability in that code base, you potentially put at risk the entire stability of the network. And we saw this years ago with Ethereum, when the Go version of the Ethereum client was the predominant node on the network. And then there were other kind of implementations that had to kind of come into the market in C++, and Java, and Rust. So we've actually been developing out of our Shanghai team a second implementation of the AION client in Rust, which will be coming and available live also on the same time frame, probably by end of the year, if not kind of first thing in January. But that process has been in development for about 6 months in our Shanghai office. So we're pretty excited about that, because that'll be a whole new layer of security and kind of redundancy built into the network to make sure that there's not critical aspects of the network that could go down as a result of a bug.
Right. Well, it sounds like there's a lot happening. Let's talk about your team. You've mentioned that now. How is the team growth with regard to the Shanghai team, your other team? I think you're based in Canada. So how big is the team actually in total as well, and is it expanding?
Well, we've kind of frozen on expansion. I mean, as you can imagine, market conditions impact everybody, us included. We're sitting at about, I'll have to do latest count, but something like 60 to 65 people. And we found that this is a very, very solid sized team to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. So we don't anticipate a huge amount of core growth inside the foundation. What we are working significantly more on is growth outside the foundation, growth among ecosystem companies and partners of ours that are building products and tools on top of the protocol. But that distribution looks like 14 or 15, if I'm not mistaken, people in Shanghai, 6 people in our Barbados office, and something like 42 or something in our Toronto office. And again, I'd have to go back and actually count the list, but yeah,
Right.
those are the ballpark numbers.
The numbers are looking good though, Matt, because you have grown substantially since we last spoke. And I also wanted to ask you with regard to this team growth, clearly the plan is to connect with enterprise. And I want to talk to that about Nuco, for example, and what is the plan to provide that integration into the permission world of blockchain? How are you going to really build out the business side?
So we don't have a core roadmap within the foundation for kind of private networks. What we are doing is we're supporting 2 third-party initiatives, one by a company called MavenNet, founded by one of my co-founders, Gus and Frank, and another one by a company called Centris, close connections of ours operating out of Eastern Europe, and both of whom are working on an active enterprise roadmap to work on private implementations of the AION protocol for the enterprise market. I mean, my general sentiment on this is that I think there's going to be a need in the market for these private networks, but I think people are underestimating that large enterprises are going to become more comfortable with public networks, and that the enterprises that we should be most focused on are the ones that are willing to adopt these public utility networks sooner. And and we use the word enterprise very lightly because I don't like to make it sound like we're working with incumbent old school paper-based companies. We're more talking about how do we support the growth of new enterprises, the growth of new companies that have massive opportunity for growth on top of our network, and helping establish the enterprise of the future rather than worrying so much about the enterprise of the past. But there's a kind of balancing act in there. Some of the work that MavenNet is doing with their private networking and bridging technology that they're working on is how do you connect private networks into the public network using similar bridging technology to what we've built. And I think all of these things are going to be very useful in terms of talking about enterprise adoption. And then the AVM strategy is obviously a big topic with these enterprises as well, because they tend to lean very heavily to the Java world in terms of where their engineering skills are. So anything that can give them kind of more familiar tools is a helpful kind of on-ramp for these types of engineers.
Right. So clearly the potential for this engagement with enterprise is really quite considerable, given that you are going to move into the world of Java. You are moving into the world of interconnecting at some point somehow. That's what I'm hearing, into that enterprise and permission sphere, although you are fundamentally that public, decentralized, permissionless system. In that regard though, Matt, I mean, obviously you're aware of this strong push for these amalgams we see, where we see permission and permissionless hybrids emerge.
Yep.
Are you concerned at all that that's the new wave of narrative in blockchain to really capture the potential for profit, to really capture the potential for blockchain in business, to be more so a technology rather than be that fundamental public chain conduit that we hear right from the very first iteration of blockchain?
Yeah, and I wouldn't say I'm concerned, because I haven't seen anything that gives me much confidence that this stuff is real. I've seen a lot of proof of concepts. I've seen a lot of prototypes. I've heard a lot of narrative of how these projects have failed to prove anything. Not to say that it's not a healthy thing for these enterprises and these types of incumbent companies to be testing this technology and wrapping their heads around it. But I've kind of viewed these things significantly more as kind of testing environments rather than production systems. And whether that's the enterprise Ethereum work that continues to happen among the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, or the work that IBM and Hyperledger have been working on for years, or R3 and Corda, we haven't seen much indication that this stuff has picked up steam in the way that they expected it to pick up steam. And so we still fundamentally believe that at the end of the day, the values of public networks are going to be that you remove and completely transform some of these business models. It's not good enough in our minds to just kind of repurpose the exact same business models where you're kind of putting barriers to entry into a system and charging kind of a gatekeeper fee to use that system. You haven't really fundamentally changed anything. I mean, we're speaking a lot more often about this narrative of what we call broken by design. And broken by design is the fact that there's realization that there's some industries and some companies where small tweaks will not be sufficient, because small tweaks imply that the core proposition is still grounded in some sort of value. We're talking a little bit more transformational of saying that many of these industries that we're addressing actually need significant re-architecting. They're not just tweaks to business models. And this kind of goes back to the point of like, who is the enterprise that we're targeting? Is it the incumbent that has kind of entrenched itself in an old way of doing business? or is it the new company that might come out with a completely new model that's going to grow at a pace that people may not expect, and create the new, the new internet giants of the next 20 years?
Absolutely.
And that's kind of what we're expecting.
And clearly you're trying to really lead the way in this modern approach and be quite progressive. But Matt, I want to talk to you also about what you're doing with regard to that blockchain and service approach. You talked about the suite of tools that you offer.
Yeah.
Are you currently talking to significant, I guess, businesses and governments? We always do talk about this when we discuss it, but are you in fact having these discussions now to really onboard these kinds of parties that potentially can use and adopt this in the future as you're ready?
Yeah, and then we've got two models that we work on, and just to boil it down to really simple language. I mean, the two models that we work on is we're working on kind of a pseudo full serve. How do we help people actually on ramp? It's not a scalable model because we don't have the capacity nor the desire to go out and talk to 100 companies around the world about why they should be building on AION. The self-serve model that we're building is where we're putting a lot more of our focus, which is really how do you, and if you get to know kind of the software developer community, you realize that software developers are really kind of enthusiastic about kind of teaching themselves and learning new approaches and learning new tools on the back of documentation and really good tutorials and really good Stack Overflow conversations. And that's where we're trying to put more and more of our focus. How do we empower developers with the tools and documentation and kind of instructional guides that they need in the languages that they're familiar with to be able to build the things that they find interesting? So we're not trying to define which industries are most impactful, which use cases are most impactful. We're just trying to create the canvas so that people can kind of jump in and paint whatever they want. And that's where we think we're going to see the most creative business outcomes. Not so much us saying, hey, the vertical we need to be focusing on is supply chains or government process optimizations or anything like that. We have very strong opinions, of course, but at the end of the day, we've even, you may notice on our website, we've kind of shifted this narrative towards build the future you want. And our role as the AION Foundation is enabling people to build the future they want through tools and through technology, rather than stepping in too heavy-handedly in terms of defining which direction they should go.
Right. So Matt, you're basically providing the canvas, as you said, and really espousing this kind of paint creation and offering all the tool sets as that palette. But how do you sustain the ability to continue to reproduce the canvas? How are you going to be able to ensure beyond the raise that you've made, and obviously you're using that in this bear market, how do we go beyond that once you run out of funds?
Oh, you mean financially? Yeah.
Right.
I mean, let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, there's two things that are probably going to be interesting to people. One, this week is the week that we are publishing our financial reports. They're going to be published on the 28th of November, which is coming up in 2 days. And this is going to be what we expect to be the first project to do kind of a completely transparent reporting on its financial statements. We've done this alongside our partners at Deloitte. And for one, we wanted to give people confidence that, hey, transparently, here's the state of our financials. Obviously, everybody in this market is exposed to the industry, to the fluctuations of the industry, whether it's the prices of Bitcoin, Ether, or AION. So that impacts us, of course, but we're still sitting on more than enough runway to be confident in our next 1.5 to 2 years. And then we're also starting to develop a strategy for how do we move forward into a more sustainable financial model. People should remember that beyond the raise that we did during our ICO, we also maintained a pretty significant balance of AION inside the foundation for future purposes. And one of those purposes could be fundraising. So we have not kind of articulated what that strategy looks like yet because we haven't figured it out, in all its details at this point. But we are open to the idea of re-engaging with strategic supporters and investors in the future, to potentially back some of the work that we're doing in different verticals, either through community companies that we're helping get off the ground. And these could be traditional equity investments of products and services that are being built around the AION ecosystem, or even getting new supporters for the AION Foundation. So we don't look at the state of our finances as a runway that goes down to zero, because we are very actively developing a financial model that gets us beyond our current proceeds.
Right. Well, obviously that sounds like you're thinking about other ways in which you can really expand the raising potential for different projects that you're looking for in the future. But Matt, I really want to talk to you though about the current state of the market. Obviously,
Sure.
There's a lot of people are concerned about that, and I want to talk about that in the conjunction or in the context of the anomaly we see with speculative markets and then your own token value. So to be clear on this, I really want to understand from you, for the audience, how are you redressing the issue that people are speculating on your token that's designed as a utility token fundamentally, but they're treating it as a security right now by, essentially betting on its value? How are you going to cope with that in the future to ensure that your utility is a true utility?
Well, two things. One, the only thing that we can really do is encourage the right type of adoption, encourage the right type of use, and grow the number of people that are kind of leaning on and building businesses around the functionality of our network and our coin. There will always be people that look at these assets, as some form of commodity with some form of kind of future value ascribed to them, regardless of what we do. I mean, that's the nature of having fungible, secondary markets around these types of assets. So this is a challenge for most projects. I think it has some pros and cons. I mean, it allows us to see signals from the market at a pace that is not usual for a company of our stage. Many of these signals are a lot of noise, but sometimes within that noise, there's important signals. There's important messages for us to learn in terms of what people are reacting well to, what the market is interested in, what type of technology is really kind of turning people's heads. And like it or not, we're not blind to the fact that developers are more likely to work with technologies that are gaining the right types of reputations from a public market perspective. So, by no means is this existential, because AION as a token price does not impact our ability to operate, because we don't fund any of our operations off of the AION coin. So, when people look at the market and they wonder whether or not this impacts the AION Foundation, the AION Foundation has exposure in its operating budget to Bitcoin and ETH. It does not have exposure in its operating budget to AION. What it does, cause concerns for on our end is the fact that AION is used within some of our external distribution programs, like our grants and bounties, right? So when we're working with third parties that are building tooling and infrastructure that sits above the AION network, we're issuing and distributing grants to these recipients in many cases, to help them through the engineering costs of getting some of these things done, and to kind of keep them incentivized to work with us. And so that comes into question because of the fact that there's a shifting price. It's more difficult to kind of peg a value to some of these services. But so far we've been, the whole market's going down. We're just kind of biding our time and holding our breath. And I think there's going to be projects that prove that they're capital efficient enough to sustain a pretty long period of bear market kind of behavior. And we're definitely one of those projects that, we haven't looked around to many of our peers to see how we compare, but I could say that we are, extremely meticulous when it comes to deciding how and when to spend money, because we're trying to make sure that we make every dollar go as far as possible.
Right. Well, it's good to know that your token value, as we see it from the public side, doesn't determine the viability of your business and the viability of your project, because obviously there is that strong assumption for many in the community, assuming that because they're seeing the decline in the price significantly of almost all startups right now, worrying that it potentially could cause some problems for you internally. But you're saying clearly there's not an issue.
Yeah, and then I think this is kind of a factor of how new and immature our industry is to a certain extent, is the fact you compare our industry to any equivalent companies of our sizes in other technology fields. Most of them at this stage of their lives don't have public tickers. They don't have secondary markets. They don't even know the value of the asset of their company in many cases. So this is kind of sometimes important but sometimes distracting fact that just kind of floats around projects. Many of us are working on roadmaps that extend well beyond kind of the daily, weekly, monthly fluctuations that we see in the market. Not to say that these are not important factors to consider, but they do not reflect kind of the state of our evolution, the state of our technical, maturation or anything like that. Because generally we're all kind of sticking with some major ebbs and flows of how this market reacts, and then little variations here and there.
I see. So given that, Matt, I want to ask you this directly. Obviously, people, when they first participated in your utility token, they treated it as a security. There's no way around that. They did. And even though it's not designed that way, fundamentally, that was the sort of the mentality. So given that they were really trying to uphold the beginnings of AION, do you do anything from the internal team's position to really bolster the PR, to really ensure that people are informed as much as possible to respond to the demands of being informed for the reason that they are invested in or they participated in this utility? Is there something that AION is conscious of?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think if people follow our channels closely enough, they would notice that we are very actively contributing and sharing updates to the project. We are starting significantly more aggressively, and I think a lot of people will appreciate this. We started two kind of new public communication channels. One that's going to be both built within our blog, but one that's going to be, it's called the Rebuild, and the Rebuild is going to be more of a sharing of kind of perspectives on the impact of like societal impact of decentralization and things like that. And the other one's going to be called AION Insights. And AION Insights is going to be significantly more on the technical opinions and updates from the engineering team themselves in terms of what they're building, what problems they're solving, how they're solving those problems, and their general opinions of other projects in the industry. So we're trying to give a significantly larger voice to individual members of our team that are working on various aspects of our technology to share that with the community more publicly. But I think if anything, we've done our best to be as vocal and transparent as possible in terms of updates and milestones and kind of ongoing activities within the foundation. What we are going to get better at is sharing some of our opinions and perspectives. And that's something that we've heard time and time again from members of the community, where they want to understand how we see ourselves and compared to alternative technologies in the market, and how do we do kind of a good technical analysis to compare some of the stuff we're building to some of the stuff that other people are building. Not so much in a competitive way, but just to be able to put those types of facts out there for people to consume. So there will be a lot more of that. On the more traditional communication front, we have been stepping up the amount of communication we have on an individual basis with larger organizations that support the project and follow the project. We also got significant feedback around how to structure this financial reporting process that we're going through to make sure that the information that we're publishing is useful to the people that are receiving and viewing it. And so this will be publicly available. Of course, along with this report, we're launching a new website for the AION Foundation. So there'll be kind of two different websites, one for the AION network and the technology surrounding AION, and the other one for the foundation, describing the governance and finances and all these things around the organization.
Right. Well, it sounds like
so all of this is, the intent is obviously to continue to put out as much information as possible. So we're not blind to the fact that people are hungry for more data, hungry for more information, and we're going to get better at that.
Absolutely. Well, Matt, let's talk about a tough topic now, and that's the SEC. They're cracking down, there's no question, on certain projects, and that's not to say that they're cracking down on all of them, but there is an allusion to moving towards securitization of the blockchain in 2019 and beyond. Are you concerned? I know it's a tough one, but are you concerned at all that they are going to imbue or color blockchain, both now and of the past, in fact, with this sort of security element? Or are you confident that you'll move in a different direction and they'll deem you as you are, and that is a utility?
Listen, I'm not a lawyer, and I won't speak for our general counsel or any of the law firms that we work with. But I'll tell you from my observations, quite simply, there's a couple of things that make us stand out in a positive way from our perspective. One is that we are building a base layer protocol that is in live production development that people are already using and building businesses on top of and integrating services into. This is not a future promise of technology. This is an active roadmap and an active production system. Secondly, I mean, time and time again, we've reiterated this to the community. We have made a huge effort to not engage in any type of promotional behavior or promising of any type of future anything. So people follow us on the basis that they find the project interesting based on its merits and they find the technology appealing. We're constantly trying to find that balance to make sure that people are well informed, but we're not kind of talking too far into the speculative and the promises of future value. And I think if I were not speaking for the AION Foundation, but just kind of personal observations here, I think if I see any common ground among some of the names that have popped up in the past recent weeks, a lot of them share the commonality of having been a little bit overly promotional and having promised things that were maybe unrealistic.
No question.
And this is not to say that regulation and the direction of where regulators around the world is going is not something top of mind for us. We follow this very closely, and we work very actively with legal counsel in many different jurisdictions. But we're actively trying to position AION to be among the good actors in this industry. Part of this, concept of us getting transparent and voluntarily transparent with our finances is to show that there is such a thing as like ethical behavior in the blockchain industry, and that not everybody's out for a quick buck. And hopefully Aion can kind of set some standards around what that looks like.
Right. And obviously, Matt, with your relationship with Ethereum, they've already been deemed a commodity by the SEC, ironically, since they don't cover the commodity side of things. But certainly it's looking good for you. You do have an active system right now, which is another thing that is relevant, given that there are projects coming that, because they haven't, they're at much greater risk of being deemed securities for the future. So it's important that you provided that information, and I think that it will allay some of those concerns to the community. But Matt, if we could talk about now that buzzword of interoperability, it is always something that is at the fore of my mind when I think of Aion. How is the old discussion of the triple alliance, the one chain, the Aion and the Icon? I want to talk about that just very briefly. Is this just lip service now at this point?
I would say lip service. I'd say, there's still a very strong relationship between the three projects, but, as you can imagine, what we've learned a little bit more the hard way is that it's everybody's got their own set of priorities, and it's quite difficult to get everybody to align resources to a common set of priorities. We've gone in slightly different directions in terms of how we are implementing our hypotheses around interoperability. How do we actually bring to market the idea of kind of generic data messaging between blockchains is quite unique to us among our peers. And it's been, more of a relationship builder at this point. The team dynamic between us and Icon and Wanchain, we continue to support each other when we're in each other's markets. We continue to welcome each other, that type of thing. But there's no active work happening between these three projects. Unlike our original hope is that we would have found kind of common ground for shared research or for shared implementation, but we were really on very, very different roadmaps, and trying to reconcile that ended up being more of an effort than we anticipated. So right now, I'd say we're active friends, and that's about the extent.
Right, and I really appreciate that honesty, because right now it sounds like you're very focused on Aion, and you're moving ahead with everything, or full steam ahead with what you need to do. Now, let's talk through the vision for 2019 specifically. What do you foresee, given that you have a lot going on, with what you want to achieve with the team by the end of next year? Say, what's the really big milestones you want to hit?
Yeah, so as I kind of alluded to, a big focus is on making sure that usability around the Aion network is kind of first and foremost a matter of getting adoption in from developer communities stemming from existing crypto developers to non-blockchain developers that come more from traditional markets like the Java world. In terms of our core roadmap, you're going to see a huge amount of activity around not only the AVM, but our new designs for hybrid consensus, which we think is going to be a very, very novel approach to scaling consensus while maintaining decentralization in a way that we haven't seen any other project attempt yet. And so we hope to be able to kind of put out some of the research that we're doing on the consensus side in short order, probably in the next month or two, and start to get feedback from the market and community in terms of what the general sentiment is around some of these proposed solutions. Mm-hmm. And then on the interoperability side, we have a continued roadmap for bridging, but we also have very active research happening in terms of, is there other solutions to interoperability that are not, what we've defined as bridging? And what we've defined as bridging, just to clarify, is kind of this idea that between two networks, you would have a common group of nodes that are able to verify and process transactions across the networks and act as signatory for those transactions as they cross between networks. That design is actively in development and going into production. It's a similar design to what we worked on for the Aion token bridge, but we're also now starting to unlock the possibility that there are other ways to prove transaction integrity across networks without necessarily having bridges as intermediaries in those processes. And so this is new research that we're kind of engaging in, new lessons that we've learned since writing the white paper in kind of May, June of 2017. So we're constantly going back and questioning some of the original assumptions that were in our design to see, is there better and newer ways of solving these problems that that weren't in the market, a year and a half ago when we went through this process.
Mm-hmm. Right. And obviously the AVM is coming. So can you talk us through some prospective partners as well, business relationships by name? Are there any things that are coming in that are in the pipeline that are going to really expand this network of essentially that business frame?
There's nobody that I'm kind of able or willing to mention right now, because this is obviously, it's always bilateral in terms of the other party having to be ready to do this as well. What I will say is we're going to be doing a lot more in terms of sharing names and information about projects that are building on top of the AION protocol pretty shortly. There's going to be a lot more work done in terms of capturing and demonstrating some of the ecosystem activity that's happening around AION, so that people can get like a view into who some of these projects are. And then other kind of loose direction that I can point you in is the fact that because of our focus on Java, we're able to start engaging in relationships that are significantly more on the established traditional developer tooling market rather than kind of net new blockchain tooling companies. And so we're finding a balance between the two, where we want to bring in relationships of established kind of mature tooling infrastructure companies that kind of carry over from the web industry, and make available kind of familiar workflows that developers are used to.
Right.
So that's
Matt,
kind of a big active push for us.
It sounds like you're understating the magnitude of this, because clearly that market is huge. Given that you can essentially port that capacity from the old school to the new school.
I think our view on this is that, I always constantly say like 99% of the market hasn't shown up yet, but I think realistically it's more like 99.9% of the market hasn't shown up yet, meaning the engineers that are solving for problems on top of blockchains are still a very, very niche niche group. We're trying to do a significant leapfrog towards essentially a easy path to adoption for any software engineer that comes from a more traditional background. And the implications of that, if we do this right, and if we get the timing and tooling support right, could be a significant inflow of new engineers that are not spending time looking at blockchains as an infrastructure today. And part of that, in our, back to this framework that I mentioned to you, this blockchain readiness framework, is a realization on our part that we're not just comparing ourselves as an infrastructure compared to other blockchains. We are comparing ourselves as an infrastructure compared to web infrastructure. We're saying, how do we position AION to outpace and outcompete the traditional infrastructures that are commonplace in the web world today? And on a given timeline that will include Amazon Web Services, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, and the long list of cloud providers that now house 95% of the internet's businesses. We need to make ourselves appealing as an infrastructure to capture that market share, not to capture EOS, Ethereum, and Definity's market share. I mean, that's kind of the smaller potatoes at this point. So we've got a lot of our focus on this kind of that traditional market, and how do we make it easier for them to come into our space. Absolutely,
Matt. Well, it's been a really interesting interview, because we've had a chance to really explore different parts of it that you're currently doing with your team and that you're planning to build out, especially the AVM. That's quite an interesting achievement, that you're going to set this in motion for your own architecture to really flourish. Interesting to hear that you're really planning out how you're going to engage the mainstream market as well. Matt, what would you like to say to those who perhaps are worried about the market? They're sitting in their seats at home, really looking through at the coin market cap, scared that the token itself reflects the longevity and the potential of AION. What would you like to say to them to really allay some of their concerns?
I mean, I think there's two things. One, AION's development process and kind of interaction with the developer community outside of the foundation is changing. I mean, the ability for people to interact and collaborate and contribute to the project is becoming significantly easier and more open. We've done this through the AIP, or AION Improvement Proposals process. We're going to be designing and building this in directly into our internal committees on how do external members of the community and developers from other organizations start participating in our governance process. And this is going to be something we're going to be talking a lot more about going into 2019, is what's the right governance structure for an open source nonprofit foundation like AION. In terms of, observers and enthusiasts that are following the industry, I'd say, keep in mind that this is a long game. Keep in mind that there are projects among us that may not be able to sustain throughout challenging times in the industry. And we're really looking for signals that point to which projects are going to come out the other end. And, not knowing how long situations like this last and how long, the quote unquote crypto winter can extend. You're really hoping to, if you pull yourself away from some of the general market signals that people are looking at, and just look at fundamentals in terms of what does sustainability look like, what does focus look like, and who's still working on the right things. And I think, with that lens, you'll probably find a small but solid number of projects that are still focused, that are not being dissuaded by this. And then, if you kind of adjust your timeline to whatever the reality is of our market, you'll probably end up finding that these things come back, to the full promise that we've talked about in terms of building a global infrastructure. And the possibilities and opportunity of that are massive. It's just the timeline that's a question mark.
Absolutely, and it's well said, I think, Matt, because obviously you're confident that you're one of those few that really can build out into something that is sustainable and real for the future. As you said, this is a longitudinal perspective. We are looking for decades of development, not just for Aion, but for blockchain-related enterprise and startups. So I really thank you for your time today, Matt. Hopefully the audience has had a chance to have a greater insight into what Aion's doing right now. I look forward to talking to you in the next few months as you develop. Really looking forward to hearing about the release of your AVM and how that's going to impact on the broadening of your ecosystem. But until then, thanks very much for your time. You are leading something that is innovative, it is new, it is potentially revolutionary in terms of technology for reframing decentralized marketplaces. Thanks very much, Matt, for your time.
Thanks, Brad. Always a pleasure.
Likewise.